Professor Braga, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. The only thing is Hangout is hanging my computer off. So let's see if it works.
It's working great right now, and you know what? You show the traits of a great trader. You don't give up, you're persistent, and thank you for being persistent and being with us today. I'd like to start with a question. How did you gravitate towards specializing in global economics? What was the attraction to wanting to know how the global economy worked?
Well, as I often tell my students, you cannot plan these things. Of course, it depends on your curiosity. It depends on accidents that happens throughout your professional life. In reality, I was originally trained as a mechanical engineer,
Wow.
and living in a country like Brazil and of course facing issues with high levels of inflation and
Yes.
growth issues, this made a natural interest in economics to blossom, and I began to work. I did a master's and then a PhD in economics, and one thing led to another. I entered and had a career with the World Bank where I worked for 21 plus years. So it's one thing led to another. It was not planned.
You know, sometimes the best things that happen to us in life, Professor, are things that aren't planned, almost serendipitous, and it's like a magnet. And so, really, it was living under the economic conditions that you were trying to build your life with in Brazil, and seeing a lot of financial upset, currency crises, uh, the default in Brazil in the 70s that drove you to go, you know, I want to figure this out. Why is this happening? And your career took you on this path. And what a great time for us to be talking to you about what's happening globally in the economy. And why don't we start with your home country, Brazil, with what's happening there, Petrobras, fraud, scandal, you know, other South American countries experiencing some difficulty. And a lot of them, the problem, they're probably breathing a sigh of relief today because the dollar turned. And a lot of their problems are being pegged to the dollar, which is making it even more difficult for them to service debt as well as falling commodity prices. So is there a light at the end of the rainbow, and would a lower dollar help these countries recover?
Well, of course, each country has its own characteristics, but if we talk about countries that are dependent on commodities, as is the case of Brazil, and the evolution of the dollar has significant implications for how the economy is going to evolve. Brazil is in an economic crisis, as everybody is quite aware nowadays. I would argue that it's much more a political crisis than an economic crisis. But there is, of course, a strong economic uh, undercurrents, making the adjustment even more difficult because, to a certain extent, a model of development that Brazil pursued for the last 12 years or so, which was based on high price of commodities, which was based on domestic credit expansion, which was based on a protected economy, and also lots of intervention in support of so-called national champions. This model,
Petrobras, Petrobras,
among others,
yes.
this model has come to its limits. It has been able to deliver uh, some income redistribution, and in this context is well appreciated by segments of the population, but had a very negative impact in terms of productivity and in terms of modernization of the economy. So, as I said, the model has reached its limits, and if you connect to the political crisis that has been becoming more acute over the last 12 months, of course, there is a strong linkage here in the sense that the government, the party in power, and its allies have also used mechanisms associated with corruption and not very transparent practices in terms of how some key enterprises operate to siphon resources in support of political objectives. The good news is that Brazil is showing the capacity, or even a developing country like Brazil, is still an emerging economy, to have a judiciary power that is significantly independent and able to pursue the kind of problems that we are facing. So these are the good news. The bad news is that you ask if there is a light at the end of the rainbow. Well, I would say that right now, and changing from rainbow to tunnel, the only light that I can see is a train coming in the wrong direction, because the headwinds that the Brazilian economy is going to face in the international arena, be it because of the expected continued appreciation of the dollar vis-a-vis currencies like the euro and the yen, be it because of the price of commodities that probably are going to continue to be subdued for a while in view of the deceleration of the Chinese economy. All of this makes the adjustment in the case of Brazil more difficult at this point in time.
Do you think that the real should be unpegged from the dollar?
Well, the real was never really pegged to the dollar. It was a floating managed currency and continues to be. But over the last 12 months or so, we have seen significant depreciation of the real, more than 40% against a basket of relevant currencies with which Brazil trades. So in this sense, this problem of significant appreciation of the real that Brazil experienced during the commodities super cycle has been partially corrected. We can debate what is the right value for the real, but compared to last year, we are, as I already mentioned, 40% devalued. So in this sense, this is beginning to help an adjustment in the current account, although the response of, for instance, the exporting sector has been somewhat muted so far, in part because of what is happening with the price of commodities, in part because of the political and economic crisis, in the sense that there is lots of uncertainty, and that this affects decisions to engage in business right now. But I would expect, yes, that we are going to see continued improvement in terms of the balance of trade of Brazil, maybe not at the velocity that the government would like, but the direction, at least, is the right one. How much more the real needs to adjust, it will depend a lot on the domestic situation. On one hand, with the dramatic recession that Brazil is facing, probably in the -3 to -3.5% range in 2015 in terms of negative growth. Imports, of course, are diminishing significantly. Exports, as I said, we have not yet seen a significant rebound, but the current account, yes, has already begun to show signs of improvement.
Okay, and what is your, this is timely because we did have an ECB decision and also policy adjustments for their QE program, and the reaction was a higher euro based upon what the ECB and Draghi said today. What do you make out of that, and do you think that this is just a short-term blip of the euro recovering, and do you see any potential signs that the dollar could begin to weaken if the Fed does not move in December, or even if they move, the economic numbers have not been extremely strong? We had a very negative manufacturing number this week in the U.S. So first of all, your reaction to what Draghi and the ECB did today, and second of all, is it possible that the U.S. Economy isn't as strong as the global currency traders believe, and couldn't even higher interest rates weaken the U.S. dollar?
Well, of course, I'm not operating as many of you are in the day-to-day operations in the Forex market, and as a consequence, I don't pay too much attention on a day-to-day, let's say, blips in the market, simply because my, let's say, working hypothesis continues to be that we are going to see divergence in terms of monetary policies in the U.S. vis-a-vis the European Union, the Eurozone, to be more precise, and Japan. So I don't know if it's going to be December or if it's going to be March, but definitely we are going to see interest rates beginning to go up in the United States. I think that in the case of Europe, even irrespectively of what happened today, the medium-term trend will continue to be one for an accommodating policy, with maybe some adjustments in QE, not that much in terms of the size, probably in terms of the options to operate in the market. And as a consequence, I continue to expect the dollar to appreciate in relative terms vis-a-vis the euro. But this is a medium to long-term perspective. In between, of course, you can have many gyrations in the market. So, yes.
Let me ask you this. I understand the day-to-day. On a macro level, Professor Braga, do you believe fair value in the euro is 90 cents, 85? When it was initiated, in Deutschmark terms, it was about 80, 85 cents. Do you have any projections as to what would be a fair valued euro against the dollar, and or what would be an undervalued euro against the dollar?
You can do exercises with, let's say, purchasing power parity type of analysis, and probably at this point in time, you could even argue that the level that we have nowadays is probably close to equilibrium. But again, what will determine, in my mind, the value of the euro in the next 12 months or so is going to be the relative trends in monetary policy in the US and in Europe. And as I already mentioned, I do expect they to diverge, although I fully agree that to read the leaves of the American economy today is very complex, but I think there is a growing consensus among policymakers in the US that it's a little bit more hawkish in terms of interest rates. So I think December is probably going to see some change. And As a consequence, at least in the medium term, the trend, in my mind, is going to be towards a stronger dollar rather than a weaker dollar. How much? I don't know. If I knew, I would have retired by now.
Yes, we'd all be fishing.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears towards China, Professor. And they've taken some draconian steps in the last 6 months. They made it illegal to short stocks. They were the big engine of commodity demand. Obviously, that's being reflected not just by a strong dollar pressuring it, but lower demand, final demand coming from China. And what's your reaction to the yuan being included in the IMF SDR? What's your outlook on China? Are people too bearish about China at this point of time?
Well, I think that the perceptions about China, of course, are very much influenced by the long trajectory of dramatic growth that the Chinese economy has uh, demonstrated and be able to consistently sustain. So then people say, well, we were in double digits, now we are around 7%, and of course there is a debate about the quality of this data, but it's still growing quite fast, and now we are seeing signs of deceleration, maybe towards 6. Well, first thing is to keep in mind that the Chinese economy is nowadays a huge economy, and 6% of roughly $10 trillion has a much bigger impact in the world economy than 12% growth of a 2 trillion economy. So we have to keep things in perspective. In this sense, I would expect China to continue to be a major contributor to world growth. Having said that, it's also true that there are some huge imbalances in
Yes.
China. One number that comes to my mind is just to look, for instance, at the consumption of cement in China. Between 2011 and 2013, China consumed more cement than the United States in the whole of the 20th century. So obviously, this is, let's say, something unsustainable. It reflects the huge investment in infrastructure that the Chinese economy is going through. It reflects also different modes of construction in these countries. But we know for a fact that there is lots of investment in real estate that has been financed, particularly by the so-called shadow financial sector in China, that
Yes.
may face problems, and an adjustment will happen. Am I, let's say, expecting a hard landing in China? No, I think that the government does have the levers, let's say, to manage this process. But definitely we are going to see much less appetite for commodities for a while. We are going to see a slowdown, let's say, in imports, and the adjustment is going to be interesting, to say the least, in terms of how, from a political point of view, the government is going to handle this. Now, you mentioned the SDR and the yuan becoming part of the basket. This,
Yes.
from the point of view of the Chinese government, has been a major objective, and
Yes.
can debate if China really has, let's say, all the characteristics that the rules of the game require for you to have to be characterized as a reserve currency. But definitely the yuan is moving in that direction, and it's much more a question now of financial debt and liberalization. I don't know how quickly the Chinese government will be able to let's say, move in this direction. Because in the case of China, if you ask the Chinese government, okay, is the yuan determined by the market? And they will answer, yes, definitely. We make sure that supply and demand are, let's say, influenced by right policies from the central bank for us to obtain a stable yuan. That's the, let's say, that interpretation of market force. You can debate if this is really what the IMF had in mind in terms of really exchange rate and in terms of reserve currency. But it is a very important development in terms of the status of the Chinese economy, and is something that is consistent with the growing weight of the Chinese economy in the world economy.
Let me ask you this. What do you think was behind their strategy for mass accumulation of gold?
Come again, I had a problem in hearing you.
What do you think is behind China's move to accumulate mass quantities of gold over the last couple of years? What's the reason for it?
Well, again, with the huge current account surplus of China, you had a situation in which the country, first over time, of course, built significant reserves, probably more than what would be optimal, and also invested in assets like gold. But to be very frank, it's not an area that I would claim any expertise, but I think it goes along the lines of, let's say, building buffers, given the opportunities also that China sees in terms of investment.
How about down the road having a gold-backed currency if fiat currencies come into question?
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far, but who knows?
All right, let's switch back to South America. Mauricio wanted me to ask you, and maybe at first you could comment on the political change in Argentina, but Mauricio wants to know what your outlook is for both Colombia and Chile.
Well, let's start with the good news. So Argentina, the new government, at least in terms of the rhetoric, is saying the right things, and one would expect some positive change in terms of becoming a more market-oriented economy. That's, let's say, the rhetoric. In practice, we'll have to see, particularly because it does not depend only of the upcoming president. It also depends on his ability to manage the Congress, where he does not have a majority. So this will be a tricky, let's say, problem. But I think that given the track record of the Kirchner's administrations, it is a welcome development, and probably will also help, for instance, in terms of the relationship with Brazil, and eventually also in terms of the overall positioning of Mercosur, the common market of South America, vis-a-vis trade negotiations. So this, I think, is good news. Now, you mentioned Colombia and Chile. These are countries that have been pursuing very different trade strategies, exactly because they actually, this is also correlated with the size of these economies, but they are much more outward-oriented than either Argentina or Brazil. And in this context, they have a much better track record in terms of engaging in trade negotiations and also liberalizing their economies. But in both cases, they are being significantly affected now by the price of commodities. But are very different strategies. I would characterize the Mercosur strategy, which is inward-oriented and based on trade diversion rather than trade creation, and the strategy of the Pacific Alliance of countries like Colombia and Chile, and in the case of Chile also, now with TPP, we are going to see additional possibilities in terms of dynamism and in terms of the Chilean brand from the perspective of foreign investors.
Okay, Professor, I'd like to wrap it with this. Say, for example, you're 22 years old, your education in hand, and you can move to start your future anywhere in the world. Where would you go?
Well, if you look in terms of broad economic trends, of course, you would go east. I expect the trend, let's say, for the economic center of gravity of the world to continue to move towards the east by countries like China, India, but also Indonesia and others. So this is a very generic proposition, because then you have to ask what are the other parameters that you would like, let's say, to
right,
consider.
including freedom, civil liberties.
Definitely, then you would rather be in Hong Kong than in mainland China.
Okay.
You would rather be in India than in mainland China. But then you have to ask, if you are, let's say, under a view of ignorance, in the sense that you are just looking in terms of opportunities, but you don't know if you are going to fit into a well segment of society or a poor segment of society, then I would say I would rather be poor in China than in India. I would rather be wealth in India than in China.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Professor. Still believe that it makes sense to learn Mandarin after talking to you.
Well, definitely that's something that will be in growing demand, although this should not be read as an interpretation that the Chinese economy is going to continue to grow at dramatic pace as we saw in the last 20 or 30 years or so. Okay?
Okay, Professor. Have a great day. Happy holidays to you, and appreciate you sharing your vast body of knowledge in the geoeconomic circle. One more thing, though. Is there anything geopolitically that you worry about at night when you see things that are happening in Syria with Russia being in the Middle East, and you talk about Chinese growth and they're building islands, and then the U.S. sends naval ships in that area? Is there anything that you put into your equation as far as what could be geopolitical risk that could throw all economic equations out the window?
Well, definitely, let's say the potential for geopolitical shocks to be much more destabilizing than in recent years has increased over the last 2 years, going from Eastern Europe, or the Ukrainian situation, to, of course, the Middle East, and also what is happening in the South China Sea. Having said that, financial markets typically discount very highly these geopolitical risks, at least till they become a major reality. Now, one area that I think, particularly for your viewers in Europe, is something that definitely will have a direct impact, and I would argue is already having a direct impact both in the politics and economics, are the migration pressures that we are seeing associated with the Middle East crisis. So this has fiscal implications, may lead to the destabilization of countries like Greece, for instance,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
may also lead to major change in terms of one of the freedoms of movement in the
Yes.
context of the European Union. That
Yes.
is something to be considered.
Thank you so much, Professor. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. Great interview. Nice to have met you as well, Professor Braga.
Okay, thank you. Happy holidays to you all.
Thank you.